So thank you everybody for joining us today. So a couple of weeks ago, I was reading an article through the Asbury Park Press, and they were talking about a man who lives in Jackson and decided to use his time during quarantine to take a pretty unique trip. So TJ Fallon, who we have with us today, was the man who decided to go on a journey, and he went to explore past president and vice president's grave sites and look at our U.S. history and the legacy of these presidents through that viewpoint. And so obviously I thought this was really a unique and cool way to look at history. And so I did a little stalking and I found TJ with the help of the reporter from the Asbury Park Press, and he connected us, and luckily TJ agreed to be with us today and to share his experience on this trip. So TJ, we thank you for giving us your time and for preparing this presentation, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. Thank you guys for having me. This is quite a pleasure. I can honestly say that when I was in the midst of all of this, I never expected that people would want to hear about where people are buried. So it's fun. It's a lot of fun. I'm going to start off just by sharing my screen because I do have a presentation that kind of goes along, so you don't have to just listen to me ramble on. I kind of titled this whole presentation, it's a quote, it's a Latin quote, Sic transit gloria mundi, which means thus passes the glory of the world. And actually the reason that I chose that title is not because I am so clever. It is actually because that is what the Asbury Park Press writer, Jerry Carino, he actually used that quote in his article. And that quote really, it's funny because I actually took Latin in high school, but I've never really heard that quote. And I thought it was very, very interesting. And it really, when I started thinking more about those words, thus passes the glory of the world, it really reflects in what I'm about to show you guys over the course of the next hour. So that's just kind of just a brief introduction page here. This page is just kind of, I just want to tell you quickly about myself. These are all photos that I took at obviously very historical places. As you can see, I am actually a divorced father. I'm 40 years old, and that's my 7-year-old son, Henry, who has been dragged to all of these historical places with me. He actually does enjoy it, I must say. But he did not join me on any of the adventures of the grave sites that I'm going to show you, except for the exception of Grover Cleveland, who's buried here in the state of New Jersey, our home state. So, but yeah, as you can see, I kind of dragged him all over the place, but he does enjoy it. And I'm just trying to teach him a little bit about history because this has been such an enlightening adventure and hobby that I've taken up. That I think it's extremely important to pass it on to other generations to really grow an appreciation for our history. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm not I get asked a lot, are you a history major? Are you someone who went to college for history? Or none of the above. Nobody in my family is a history major or anything. I've always been interested in history. I've always had a love for history. My father, when I was growing up, he's a very, very big John F. Kennedy fan. So I grew up around all the JFK things and, of course, the JFK assassination and that sort of thing. So I always was fascinated by it, even when I was a young 10, 11-year-old boy. But, it's just my love has grown over the years. But this is, I don't have a background in history, just because people always ask me that, of course. And then, of course, I always get, well, how in God's great name did you come up with this idea? And, when people first see me or first meet me, because I've met several people after this article has come out, I guess they're always shocked. I think they think that I'm going to look like somebody from the Addams family who likes hanging out in cemeteries or something like that. But I'm a pretty normal guy. And I wish that I had this elaborate, great story to tell all of you, that I had this idea from the time I was 8 years old to go on this journey, but it's really not that interesting. I wish it was. To be completely honest with you, the reason I decided to do this is first and foremost the pandemic. We've had such a crazy year of 2020 that the entire world has obviously felt the effects of this global pandemic. And after sitting around for about 3 or 4 weeks, I said to myself, well, I'm furloughed from my job. I have a lot of time in my hands. Well, what the heck am I going to do? So one day I was just Googling things on my computer, and I happened to Google famous grave sites in New Jersey. To be honest, don't even know why I did it. I just figured, let's see who's famous, who's buried in New Jersey. So, of course, I get the normal entertainers, musicians, the Whitney Houstons of the world, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, I saw our 22nd and 24th president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, who is a New Jersey native and is buried in New Jersey. So I thought that was really interesting. So I said, it's right in Princeton. I'm in Jackson, so it was only about a 45-minute or so drive. I said, one day I'm going to take a drive out there. So that's what I did. And these pictures that you're seeing here on the screen, they're the pictures from my very first visit ever to President Cleveland's gravesite in Princeton. He's buried there at the Princeton Cemetery. And then probably a few days after that, I actually had met up with one of my best friends for many years and his wife, and we decided to take a walk around a local park, do some social distancing safely outside, and just get some fresh air. And I was having a conversation with my best friend, and I said, what would be really interesting? I wonder if anybody's really just gone around and seen every presidential gravesite. And he's like, I'm sure people have done it. I said, yeah, you're probably right. And I said, but I wonder if they've seen like all of them, maybe even vice presidents. And, I just started, my wheels were turning. Well, that was probably the scariest thing I've ever thought of, because it turned into this huge long trek. I kind of have this very completist attitude with things. If I collect things, I like to get the complete set of what I'm collecting. If I do things, I like to see it through. So once I started really diving into this idea that I had in my head, I started to say to myself, well, maybe I could actually do this. I have all this time on my hands. Maybe I could actually do this. And then, of course, being the fact that we were in a global pandemic, I figured, well, can I do this safely? Can I do this responsibly, really? Can I travel all over the country and obviously not be exposed to COVID-19 or, have extra exposure to COVID-19, I should say? Can I really do this responsibly? And then I started thinking about it. And my mother, who's actually a nurse of 40 plus years, she's an old school nurse. She was immediately like, what are you going to do? Travel all over the country? This is not safe. But then I really started thinking about it. And I said, I'm going to be in cemeteries. There's probably not going to be anyone else around. And if for some odd reason the people that I'm seeing wake up, we have bigger problems than COVID-19. So I think I would be safe doing this. So that's kind of how I came up with the idea. And then it really kind of snowballed. And what I mean by that is after I went and saw President Cleveland, and then I had that conversation with my friends, I started researching more. And I realized there was a couple of vice presidents buried in New Jersey, Garrett Hobart and Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr is actually in the same cemetery as President Cleveland, but I didn't know that. So I took another trip down to the Princeton Cemetery a few days after, and I visited Aaron Burr's gravesite. And then I visited also John Witherspoon's gravesite, who is one of the 5 Declaration of Independence signers from the state of New Jersey. Well, again, that was probably not a smart idea on my part, because then it really started to snowball even further into, okay, now I have presidents, now I have vice presidents, and now I have Declaration of Independence signers. So then it really kind of went from, the presidents was the initial task, but now this page that you're seeing in front of you, this slide that you see, these are all the initial graves that I saw in the state of New Jersey. Up top here, you have Aaron Burr, these couple on the top left. He obviously was the vice president to Thomas Jefferson. Then you have next to him John Hart, who is actually one of the Declaration signers from the state of New Jersey. And then right here underneath, you have John Witherspoon, who's, again, buried very close to, right next pretty much to Aaron Burr. He's a Declaration signer from the state of New Jersey. And then, of course, we have these last three, which is Richard Stockton. Of course, we all know about Stockton University, and that he's another declaration signer from the state of New Jersey, which ironically, this plaque actually tells you they don't even know where he's buried in this graveyard. They just know he's somewhere here. And I'm going to dive into that more and more over this next, this next hour or so that I'm with you guys, because it was fascinating to me to find out how truly lost and forgotten a lot of these people are. And I don't just mean their names. The average American cannot tell you who the Declaration of Independence signers are, and they sure as heck cannot tell you who the vice presidents are, except for maybe our current vice president. But it's truly amazing to me how lost all of these individuals have become over the years. So that's kind of what sparked this idea. And then, of course, there was this big question from friends and family. Well, how the hell are you going to do this? How are you going to literally go see all these people? I don't mind driving. I'm born and raised in New Jersey, but I lived out in Montana for about 6 years, right near Glacier National Park. So I've actually driven from Montana to New Jersey and vice versa several times. So driving is not a big deal to me. But I knew it would be kind of an undertaking, speaking as I'm doing it by myself, completely solo, and I'd be going literally all over the place, and we'll kind of dive into that next. So then it became, well, where are all of these people buried? And the more research I did, I realized that, of course, the state of Virginia has the most presidents. They have 7 presidents buried there. Of course, we know about probably the 3 off the top of anybody's head that they would tell you is, of course, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. And then if you get somebody that realizes Arlington National Cemetery is actually in the state of Virginia, they'll tell you John F. Kennedy. What they won't tell you is there is another president buried in Arlington as well, William Taft. Most people forget that and don't even know that. So, and he's only about 100 yards from where John F. Kennedy is. So it's quite interesting. So when I started to really research things, I realized that, okay, well, I have Grover Cleveland in New Jersey. I have George Washington in Virginia. I have Teddy Roosevelt up in New York. I have James Garfield over in Ohio. I have Lincoln in Illinois. I have Dwight Eisenhower in Kansas. I have George Bush in Texas. I have Hubert Humphrey, a vice president all the way up in Minnesota. I have Hannibal Hamlin, another vice president all the way up in Maine. I have George Reed in Delaware, a declaration signer. And then I also have Button Gwinnett, another declaration signer from Georgia. And the reason I kind of did this slide is just to show everyone how spread out all of this really was going to be. So it was going to be quite a task to figure out, again, how the heck am I going to do this? One thing that I actually have I'm blessed with a very, very natural, great sense of direction. So figuring and mapping all these things out logistically was going to be fairly easy for me. It's just once I explain to you guys how I really did it, people probably think I need my head examined, to be honest with you. But you can kind of see just here how spread out everything really was. Like I said, Virginia has the most at 7. Believe it or not, the second most in a state is New York. New York State has 6 presidents buried in it. And then, of course, we have the third most is actually Ohio with 5 presidents. So you had a nice chunk of, what does that equal up to? 18 presidents in a matter of 3 states that were fairly close. You know, Virginia, Ohio, New York, not too crazy far logistically from where I am at New Jersey. However, somebody like good old Ike over here, Dwight Eisenhower, that's all the way out in Kansas, he was the lone one out there all the way out west. And he's the furthest west. Now, there is 2 that are further than him west. There is 2 presidents that are in the state of California. That's Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. And no, I have not gotten to those 2 yet. They're the only 2 that I have not seen. I've been to the state of California before in my life, but I have not visited their grave sites as of yet. So I don't know if I'm going to be doing that after COVID is kind of finally over with, or at least under control, or if I'm going to take another long journey in a car and go out to the other coast to see those 2. I haven't decided yet, but this is kind of just an idea of what I really did. And then it was really the planning of things. You can actually see here these screenshots you see are actually Google Map images from trips that I took. And you can kind of see these big, long, I used to refer to them to my family and friends as big lassos. It looks like a big lasso. I used to do these big, giant loops. And logistically, I'd have to figure out, okay, well, who am I seeing along the route? What else can I see along this route? Because again, I have that completist attitude as I spoke about, and it really started to turn into, okay, well, not only the presidents and vice presidents and declaration signers, what other historical stuff can I see? What other things can I see on my journey? And I've seen quite a lot. I've seen quite a lot of presidential birthplaces. I've seen quite a lot of historical things, just off the top of my head, such as Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where the Civil War ended. A lot of different things that I saw on my journeys. I'm a very, very large sports fan. I've actually seen over 70 Hall of Fame baseball players' grave sites as well on my journey. So it didn't just expand, didn't just go to presidents. It kind of was all of history in many different genres, even as far as pop culture and sports went. So it was quite interesting to map everything out. It did take a while to map things out. You probably can't see in this small writing, but like right here, it says over 1,500 miles and 31 hours of driving. And that's just to go to Ohio and Michigan, basically. So all calculated on all of my journeys, I did about 35,000 miles in a matter of about 6 months in a car by myself. Somebody actually said to me, I'm sure people have seen the presidents, maybe even the declaration signers. However, has anybody done it this fast? Somebody said, you should call up the Guinness Book of World Records. And I said, I don't think I'll do that. But it is, I've read articles about people doing this. There was one article I read about a gentleman, I think he lived in St. Louis area in Missouri, and he had seen the presidents, and he had, I think, completed about half of the declaration signers. And that alone had taken him about 25 years. So you can kind of put it into perspective of how insane this truly was on my part. Just to give you an idea of what I would do on these journeys, I would leave usually around 10 o'clock at night, drive all night to where I was going. Usually I'd calculate it so I was at my first stop when sunrise would happen. So usually 6 o'clock or so in the morning, I'd see my first sight, and I would not really stop until usually about 7 or 8 p.m. at night. So I was driving straight for usually about 20 hours on average. And then I would stop at a hotel wherever I was, and I would get a room for the night, and I would sleep. To be extra cautious, I'd bring my own pillows and blankets so I could strip the bed and be extra cautious of COVID. But, I wasn't staying in the New York City area or the Chicago area or, LA or something where you have a lot of traffic of people. I was staying in places like Paducah, Kentucky at a Best Western, which I'm sure they probably haven't had a guest, not only just this year, probably not even last year as well. So I think I was pretty safe as far as COVID, concerns went. Always took the proper precautions, of course. Always made sure I was following all of the CDC guidelines and being very cautious when I was on the road. So what I did here, I kind of wanted to jump into things. And I thought the best way to really start to show some of my pictures is to start off with the first 5 presidents of the United States. These 5 gentlemen, of course, we know the first 3 very, very well, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And then, of course, you have Madison and Monroe. These 5 gentlemen really are the founding father presidents. Monroe was really the last. He was the 5th. He was the last founding father to become president. So I thought it would be a good idea just to kind of show their pictures of where they're buried and their locations. What I did on this slide, you can see I added when they died, the date they died, how old they were when they died, and of course, where their burial site is. And of course, anybody that is watching this or doesn't already know, but you should probably know if you're a history person watching this, the most unbelievable coincidence in the entire history of mankind is the fact that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the same day, 50 years to the day of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That is the most ironic coincidence in the history of mankind. The fact that both those gentlemen who were such an integral part of the Declaration of Independence becoming what it is, the fact that they died 50 years to the day of that being signed is just absolute, only hours apart, as a matter of fact, is absolutely unbelievable. So I can tell you that in all my journeys, that still remains the most ironic thing I ever learned in any of this. So it's pretty amazing. Also, I do want to preface things. Every picture that you guys will see, except for these stock photos, unfortunately, I did not paint these photos. I wish I could take credit for that, but they were done many, many years ago. All the photos you're going to see are photos that I took myself at the locations and grave sites. So we'll kind of dive right into, of course, George Washington. Anybody that's ever been there, he's buried in Mount Vernon, Virginia. Mount Vernon is his homestead, which you can actually see up here in the top left. It's a beautiful home. There's a theme, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. The first 5 presidents or so, they all pretty much were buried at their homes. Wherever their homestead was, they were buried on that property. For anybody that has never been to Mount Vernon in Virginia, if you live in New Jersey, you're only talking about maybe tops a 3-hour car ride. You should go. It is an amazing, amazing place. It's truly beautiful. It sits right on the river. It's just absolutely amazing. And just it's my first time ever being there. I never was there as a kid. I never was there on any field trips. This was my first time ever going to Mount Vernon. And actually, Mount Vernon, along with Monticello, which is Jefferson's homestead, and Montpelier, which is James Madison's homestead, they were closed for a couple months due to COVID. They didn't allow any guests. Now, of course, because I was in the midst of doing this already, I hawked those websites like you wouldn't believe. It was like I was waiting for the winning lotto numbers. I kept hitting refresh. So as soon as they opened up, I was there. And when I went to Mount Vernon, I think it was the second day they actually opened up to the public again. I literally had the entire grounds to myself. There was no one else there. And this happened quite often. I actually said News 12 New Jersey did actually a news piece on my adventure as well, and the interviewer for them asked me, did you encounter people? The answer is no. Because of this pandemic and because of no one is obviously going to do things like this, I literally didn't see another soul during this entire adventure, with the exception, of course, being at convenience stores and gas stations and hotels. Other than that, I never saw anyone except for at Abraham Lincoln's tomb. And we will get into that in a little bit. I did see people there, not many, but there were still people there. So, I found this quite interesting that not only was I getting to the reason for me being able to do this was because of the pandemic. I took a really bad situation that we're all involved in and turned it into a positive, fun hobby. But not only that, it was remarkable to me how obviously nobody was at these places. And places like Mount Vernon, or you'll see a little later on, places like Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia at JFK's gravesite, you never have those to yourself. There's always other tourists and visitors. So it was very special to me to be able to have these places to myself. And it's kind of a unique thing. So I also don't want any of these photos to be misrepresenting what these places probably normally are, because normally in a picture like this up here of Washington's actual house at Mount Vernon, there would probably be many, many people walking around in front of that house. But obviously I had it all to myself. So very, very unique, but also just it's because of the pandemic. It's not because they cleared out the way for the guy that wants to go see all the grave sites. I can assure you of that. So anyway, so Washington, this you'll see here next to this picture of myself, this right here was actually his original tomb. His original tomb was probably about 50 yards or so down a hill from where his tomb up top here that you see where he actually is, him and Martha are now. His original tomb was down a hill about 50 yards, and that is where he was originally buried. And I do know for a fact, just based on historians' records, that Thomas Jefferson actually stood right here where I was during the funeral of George Washington. He did attend, much to Martha Washington's chagrin, because I guess there was a bit of conflict between those two at that point. But yes, Thomas Jefferson stood there. And the reason I bring that up is because my best friend, who I originally spoke to about this idea, he said to me, what in the heck is so interesting about going to see graveyards and cemeteries and gravesites? And I gave him an answer that I think changed his perspective very, very rapidly. And he really can't get it out of his head. I said, I want you to stop and think that during the time of that funeral or that procession, think about who might have stood there right where I'm standing. I mean, that's just a perfect example. Thomas Jefferson stood right there. Martha Washington stood right there. There's so much history in the fact that so many historical figures stood right there on the day of the burials of these men and women that I saw. That alone to me is pretty special and pretty interesting and unique. So the reason that they actually moved to Washington, and you would learn this if you went to Mount Vernon, is this was actually it was not built well. The engineer who built this was not thinking of the fact that this was eventually going to sink and fall off this little cliffside, and it was not exactly a very stable place to put him. So when he was still alive, he actually said to Martha and his family, we need to figure out a new place because I can't stay there forever because that's not structurally sound. So they actually did have this tomb up the hill about 50 yards, like I said, already built. However, it was not completed yet. So that's why originally he did go into this original tomb, was moved years later. And then all this brick building that you see around Washington's tomb, that was built many years later by family members and descendants of him. That was not originally built when Washington was still alive. And that was also not the original vision that George Washington had for his tomb. So that was kind of an added on thing over the years. And then, of course, moving on from Washington, we have John Adams. And the reason this is extremely special to me is John Adams is actually buried right here inside of this church. They're in a basement. This tomb that you see, this doorway to over here up top right, they're actually John and John Quincy, father and son, second and sixth president, of course. They're buried together with their wives in a tomb in the basement of this church. And the thing that's really, really fascinating about this is, as you see in this one picture here, me with my beautiful mask on, being very, very safe from COVID. This was actually a private tour. This is closed to the public and will not reopen till at least 2021 to the public because of COVID. Well, I don't like to take no for an answer. So what I did was when I found out it was closed, I emailed the church. And I got a very lovely email back from a gentleman who's one of the reverends at the church that said, TJ, we are closed to the public. However, let me know when you're going to be here, and I will privately give you a tour of this for yourself. So that actually happened to me twice, and I will get into that a little later. So this was a private tour. I had all of this to myself. The church that's inside, John Adams never actually attended that church. That church was built after he was already deceased. However, John Quincy, his son, was a parishioner at that church. They actually have downstairs, right outside of the tomb, they have, in a beautiful glass case, they actually have a hymn that John Quincy Adams wrote himself for one of the church services, which is very, very interesting, very cool to see. And they actually have his pew, John Quincy Adams' pew, that was that him and his family used to sit in. It's marked upstairs in the church. So, the first part of it is I walked into this church and the reverend's telling me all the history about the church, of course. And then he says to me, would you like to go in the basement? And, that's like asking a kid if he wants to go into a candy store. So I was like, yeah, let's go. So, of course, this is down in the basement. John Adams is right next to Abigail Adams, probably, probably in the top 3 or 4 of the most famous first ladies ever. And then right next to him is John Quincy and his wife, First Lady, who is actually the first foreign-born First Lady. John Quincy Adams' wife was, which is very interesting. So this was very cool. No, they were not originally here. John Quincy Adams, actually, there was a tomb, kind of mausoleum. It was kind of built into a hillside there's a very old cemetery right directly across the street from this church. John Quincy Adams was originally over there, and so was John Adams. However, when John Quincy Adams was still alive, he said, I don't like this. I want to be somewhere much more private, with my father. So they decided to basically start building this tomb underneath this church. And the interesting fact of that is this was never attended for the public to see. No one had these, oh, well, we have to let the public see where the presidents are buried. As a matter of fact, John Quincy Adams really had the idea that no one would ever see them except for maybe family members. So it just goes to show how different our views were obviously back then. We're only dealing with the second and the sixth president of the United States, so, very early on. But these men really didn't have this vision of they were going to be so revered that people wanted to see where their burial sites would be, 200 years later. That just really wasn't in their mindset when they originally, were back when they were living. So moving on from John, we have Thomas Jefferson. This is Monticello. That is Monticello, which is actually the word Monticello means small mountain, and it literally is on a mountainside in Virginia, which is very, very interesting. So Thomas Jefferson, just to give you a little insight, is my favorite president. Yes, it's because people did refer to him as TJ. And yes, it is also because Thomas Jefferson and I also share a birthday. He was born on April 13th, and I was born on April 13th. So there's a lot of different factors. Those are not the only minuscule little silly things why he's my favorite president. Many things. He was probably the most brilliant president we've ever had to serve as president. This man obviously single-handedly wrote the Declaration of Independence. Yes, it was revised. Yes, there was things taken out and put in, but he pretty much did it all. There was nothing that this man couldn't do. There's nothing this man didn't do. So he's buried right there. There's a big family cemetery of his. You can kind of see. Let me go back real quick. Here. You can kind of see on the bottom left here, where bottom right. I mean, there's a very big cemetery around these gates, and it's. Of course, the big rumor and what people know from history now is Thomas Jefferson did have a relationship with one of his slaves, and he had many children with several of his slaves. So all of his family and extended family is actually buried right here with him, which is very, very unique and rare because a lot of these old, houses and things like that, Washington's is one that comes to mind, Madison's as well, James Madison's as well. They not only have their family cemetery, then there's a separate area for a slave cemetery, which obviously we know about slavery being probably the biggest, darkest blemish on our history of our country. However, that's obviously just the way it was. They had a separation. But Thomas Jefferson's graveyard and his cemetery is not. There's no separation. The slaves and people that supposedly were his children from slaves are all buried in the same cemetery as him. So it's very interesting. It's a very unique thing. Monticello is unbelievable. If I could tell somebody to go to one place, it would be a toss-up between either Monticello or Montpelier, which is James Madison's estate, as far as the estates go. Yes, Mount Vernon is great, but there was something about those two places that were truly spectacular. So definitely a very, very unique, awesome thing. A very, very fun thing for me. And then, of course, like I just said, we get to James Madison and Montpelier. You can see his house down here in the bottom right. Beautiful. It is it's a pretty open. It has a little brick wall around it. It's a family cemetery. A lot of his descendants, a lot of people that were related to him are buried here. Right behind him, you can see his big obelisk. That's what these are called, an obelisk. It's probably about 15 to 20 feet tall. Right behind him, you see the smaller one behind it. That is Dolly Madison. That is the First Lady, his wife. That's where she's buried. Yes, anybody that actually knows anything, Dolly Madison, the ice cream, is named after her, of course. So she was a very, very important First Lady as well. So this was my very first time going to an estate, a presidential estate, such as Mount Vernon and the other ones. This was the first one I ever got to. And I'd never seen any of these. And again, I had this all to myself. No one was there. And it was unbelievable to me. I just could not believe, like, it feels like you take a step back in time. I almost felt like I was walking the grounds in the late 1700s. It's truly remarkable how untouched and really how well preserved it has been over the years. Again, I suggest to anybody, please make sure that you go see these places, especially if you're a history fan. These are all right in Virginia, not very far from us, and just some beautiful, beautiful farm country, especially where this is in Montpelier. Funny story from when I was at Montpelier. I had hand sanitizer spray that I've been using constantly to make sure that I'm safe. And the hand sanitizer spray that I had apparently was lavender scented. Well, I didn't really know that or didn't think much of it. I sprayed myself before I got out and walked the grounds. And I had noticed that all of a sudden I had about 20 bees chasing me at one point through the grounds of Montpelier. And then I realized, well, it's because I smelled like a flower and that's why I was being chased. So it was actually quite comical. I was all alone on this sprawling giant estate, and here I am running away from bees like a 6-year-old little boy, scared out of my mind that I'm going to get stung. And it's one of those things that just sticks in my mind. And out of all of my adventures, that'll probably be a story that I even remember when I'm 90 years old. That I got chased by bees on Montpelier because I was trying to be safe from catching germs. So I thought that was kind of funny of myself. I was definitely goofing on myself after that. And then next we have James Monroe. James Monroe is actually pretty interesting. Like I said, he's the last founding father to be president. And the thing that's interesting about him, he went and lived with his daughter later in life in New York City. He died there when he was obviously sick and old. And he was originally buried. You see these bottom two slides here on the bottom right. He was originally buried at what's called New York City Marble Cemetery. No, this headstone is not where he was buried. He's buried a little further in, probably back in the middle of this grass somewhere. However, it was locked and gated, so I could not get in. But I did want to show that is where he was actually originally buried. And then a few years later, he was interned and moved to his home state of Virginia. And that was from his family's request, of course. So he ended up, quite interestingly, if you see in the top left here, this is Monroe's actual gravesite, this big, beautiful looking cage structure. And if you notice in the top left here, you can kind of see the cage structure through the trees. And in front of it, you see this other big giant obelisk. That's actually John Tyler. It's actually our 10th president of the United States. They're actually buried right next to one another, which is interesting. That's in Richmond, Virginia, a very old historical cemetery in Richmond. But that was actually one of the easiest things. I get to check two guys off my list and literally stand 10 feet apart from one another. So those are the kind of things when you're trying to complete something like this and go on all these journeys and see all these things, you appreciate those kind of situations because you don't have to drive 2,000 miles to see the next man. You get to see him 10 feet apart. So, but yeah, I found it interesting. And another thing is a lot of these cemeteries, some of them were closed due to COVID. They just didn't want to have the public going and visiting these places and having obviously the conversion of people on one place because of social distancing. So it was one of those things that it was tricky sometimes to get around that because the reason it was so tricky is because I had to navigate sometimes on how to get into cemeteries. And I either had to contact the cemetery or I had to find a way to, there was a little opening in a gate somewhere where I could go and just go see these things. Because it was disappointing at times when you drive 2,000 miles just to learn, well, guess what? It's closed. So, and that did happen. Unfortunately, the presidential libraries, and I will show that in a few minutes here, the later presidents, the presidents really of the last 60 to 70 years or so, they are now buried on the grounds of their presidential libraries and museums. The presidential libraries and museums, due to COVID, have been closed, and they are still not opening to the public. They probably will not open until 2021. They are federally funded, so the federal government obviously has the say in whether they're going to be opened or not. And unfortunately, people like Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, you really can't see can't stand in front of their actual grave sites because it's locked due to the fact that the libraries and museums are locked. So I will show that though when I'm going through things. So that's the first 5 presidents. I thought it was important to show that. I thought it was interesting to show that because, you know, these guys were very, very responsible for how this country started. They were integral part of our history, very important part of our history. And I thought it would just be interesting to show the first 5 presidents, you know, as I was going through this presentation. And then, you know, I kind of wanted to get into the contrast of memorials. All these pictures you see here, like I said, I took myself. There's a huge, huge difference, and I don't know if it's because we became more aware or more proud of the office of presidency over the years to where we changed these sites so much, but it is extremely, when you go and see all of them, there's no denying it. There's no denying that they changed quite drastically over the years. And I'll show that obviously in these next slides. So this is the early years. Of course, you have people like Washington and Madison. We just spoke about them. They're buried right on the grounds of their own property. That was very common for the first 5 to 7 presidents. This is something that they all did for the most part. They didn't really have the foresight, like I said, that some nut from Jackson, New Jersey was going to want to drive all around the country and visit them 200 years later. They just thought that they wanted the privacy of being buried in their family cemetery right on their own property. So that is what happened for the first many years of the presidency. Even people like Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, you see here, this building here, that's Hermitage. Hermitage is his plantation in Tennessee. I actually had to go there twice. Yes, twice. I went to Tennessee the first time. Hermitage was closed to the public. Security guard met me at the gate, and I said, "How much would it cost for you to turn your back and let me go in and see the gravesite and leave?" And he said, "I can't do it." So unfortunately, I had to see other things in Tennessee, and then I had to go back and make another trip through Tennessee. So several of these states, another thing that I forgot to mention, I'll mention now, I actually traveled through 33 states since April, 33. There's actually only 4 states in the United States I've never actually stepped foot in. That's Nebraska, Nevada, Hawaii, and Alaska. Every other state I've actually been in my life, and 33 of them I visited during all this crazy madness of this road trip. So Tennessee, I was in quite a few times. So anyway, point back to my about the contrasts. You see, he's buried right where his house is in Hermitage. This burial site, this grave site's right behind the house. Again, they were all buried on their property. That was just the thing of the times. William Henry Harrison is very special to me because William Henry Harrison, this giant obelisk, which is about 100 foot tall, that wasn't built until the 1900s. That is not the way William Henry Harrison's gravesite looked. William Henry Harrison, obviously famously known for being the shortest term of president. He only lasted about 3 weeks. He gave what is known as the longest inaugural speech in the history of our country. And William Henry Harrison, who was already older at the time, he decided he wasn't going to wear a jacket. It was a rainy, cold, cold day in Washington. So he got very sick giving his inaugural speech. He spent his entire 3 weeks of presidency in bed sick, and then he died. So when he was first buried, it was basically where you see this giant obelisk, there's a door in front of this. Inside that door, you see his tomb up here. That's where his tomb is. That obelisk was not there. It was just a very small tomb inside of a hillside for over 100 years. It laid that way. The reason that it's special to me is because this is closed to the public due to COVID. The people that volunteered to take care of William Henry Harrison's tomb met me there, unlocked the door, and let me in to see President Harrison's gravesite. So him and John Adams, I literally had a private personal tour of where they're buried. So it's very interesting to me. So now we go into people like Van Buren, Tyler, and Taylor. So you have our 8th, our 10th, and our 12th presidents here. And you see, the reason I'm showing you this is very similar. You know, they have these kind of 15 to 20-foot obelisks. You know, that's just nothing major really about them, just kind of these big, tall monuments. This is actually the original site where Zachary Taylor is. Right in front of this is kind of a mausoleum building that's no bigger than any of these obelisks where he's actually buried now. It just was very, very bland. It was very blah, I will say. Interesting to see, but there was nothing overly majestic about them, that's for sure. And then you even get into Millard Fillmore, and then you get into Franklin Pierce, and then you get into James Buchanan. You see how it's pretty much, I mean, you could close your eyes and Fillmore and Pierce almost look like the same gravesite practically, except for the color. Very, very plain. As a matter of fact, very fun fact about Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was a Northerner from New Hampshire, but he was a Southern sympathizer during the Civil War. Because he was a Southern sympathizer, the state of New Hampshire would not recognize him as President of the United States. So when Franklin Pierce was originally buried, the state of New Hampshire refused to put anything on his gravesite that said President of the United States. It wasn't until many, many years later that it was added. You can actually see it here. It says 14th President of the United States. And it's because the state just didn't recognize it. And you can kind of tell, even James Buchanan, who many historians will tell you is probably the worst president we ever had, unfortunately. It's very plain. This is all that is to Buchanan's. He's buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, not far from us. And there's nothing to it. It's just very plain, very drab. There's nothing overwhelmingly like wow about it. And it almost shows, was that because that was the sentiment of the country toward these men at the time? Were these men just not revered? Were they not really somebody that the country wanted to remember? Because even during their presidencies, several of these men, Pierce, Buchanan, just off the top of my head, they were not exactly loved. That's for sure. They really did nothing to stop the Civil War from happening, and the country was very, very upset about them for that. So then we move into the years of Lincoln to Harding, and we go from these very plain obelisks and these very kind of blah sites to what in the heck happened all of a sudden. We all of a sudden went from that to we went to these visions of grandeur. You have Abraham Lincoln's in Springfield, Grant's tomb, of course, over in New York City. Shame on any of you who have not gone to see that. It's literally 50 minutes from us. It's wonderful. It's amazing. And then, of course, you have Garfield's. Garfield's in Ohio. He's from Ohio, of course. As you see, there are these giant buildings. They look like they belong, all of them look like they belong in the center of New York City, to go along with the skyscrapers. Just these amazing old, huge structures that these men are buried inside of. And this seemed to be a very, very overwhelming theme. Started with Lincoln. It ends with Harding, and I will show you that in a second. But the majority, not all, I don't want to give the misconception that every president from 16 through 29 had all of these huge, huge big buildings, because they didn't. But a large majority of them had these visions of grandeur. And it didn't really matter about their status as far as presidency, because, Lincoln was revered, Garfield was revered, Grant was revered for his time in service. But then you move on to people like McKinley and Harding, as you can see, huge. McKinley actually has about 150 steps that lead up to his big building there in Ohio. As a matter of fact, I did see a few people there when I was there, not because they were visiting President McKinley. They use those steps as exercise. They run up and down them every day. That's their daily exercise. So I find that kind of ironic. I'm sure back when President McKinley was assassinated, no one thought that, hey, they're not going to come see your gravesite. They're going to use it as, their latest Pilates training. So I'm sure that wasn't the vision many, many years ago. But you see, I mean, these huge, huge monuments. McKinley and Harding were not overly, loved presidents. McKinley more so than Harding, but Harding definitely wasn't. A lot of scandal in his presidency. A lot of bad things happened in his presidency. But yet, even though the public didn't love Warren Harding, children from all over the country, when President Harding died, they sent pennies in to get this giant monument built for President Harding. So, I mean, it just goes to show, could you imagine if I told you that one day when President Trump dies, that children were going to send in their nickels and dimes to have a giant monument built to him? it's laughable to think that way, because it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. It is the office of presidency has definitely gone from a very revered, respected office to not so much anymore. And I will tell you that it reflects very, very vividly in these men's grave sites. So you can just tell what the thought process and the sentiment of the country was many years ago, as opposed to now. You'll see we go into the Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt to George Bush type era. So these are the presidents. Roosevelt, and I will show you in a second, he is built. There's his home in Hyde Park, New York. That's where President Roosevelt spent a lot of his time in Hyde Park. It's a beautiful upstate New York, sprawling landscape. Any pictures that you see of Roosevelt where he's with his family that's not at the White House, I tell you right now, you can bet your bottom dollar it was at Hyde Park. He spent a lot of time there. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, may have been probably the most loved president while he was president of all time. I mean, he's the only man, obviously, served 3 terms in a row. He was just completely loved. I always make the joke to people that if it wasn't for the 22nd Amendment that was passed because of Roosevelt, that only presidents can serve 2 terms, I think Roosevelt would still be the president to this day, because, I mean, he was that loved. I mean, the country just loved Franklin Roosevelt. And he was kind of the first president, and you'll see here, this is his big estate at Hyde Park, and he's buried right on the grounds here at Hyde Park. So this is ran by the National Park Service. Now, inside of his estate, there is a library and a museum now. That wasn't obviously the case back when he was going there and living there. So you can kind of make the argument that Roosevelt's was the first presidential library and museum where a president was buried. However, that wasn't really the vision. The first time this really became a thing was when Harry Truman left office. When Harry Truman left office, they actually made a library and a museum specifically for Truman. And Harry Truman actually had an office at his library and museum that he used to go to every single day and work from. So this became just kind of the norm. And now from Truman all the way up to George H.W. Bush, which is obviously our latest president to pass away, this is just the theme now. All of these presidents now have presidential libraries and museums dedicated to them, and that is inevitably where their grave sites are going to be. And some people ask me, well, what about the presidents that are still living? They all have presidential libraries and museums, with the exception, of course, President Trump, because he's still in office and still currently, we don't know if he's going to serve 1 term or 2 terms yet. We don't know that yet. But even somebody like Barack Obama, President Obama's libraries in Chicago, President Jimmy Carter's is in Atlanta, Georgia. So President George W. Bush is in Dallas, Texas. So all these gentlemen already have libraries and museums built for them. Now it's just a matter of the day comes when they finally pass away. That is where they're going to go. And it's just a trend now over the last, like I said, 60 to 70 years or so of our country. That's just what happens with presidents. As you can see, Dwight Eisenhower, look, boom, Presidential Library and Museum. This chapel, he's buried inside of this. The reason this was very frustrating for me is I drove all the way to Kansas. I knew it wasn't open. I knew the library wasn't open, but the only thing separating for me from actually standing and seeing President Eisenhower's grave was this little doorway in this little building. So, they could have just left him outside in a beautiful, nice area, but no, they built this little chapel around him. So that is where he's right on the grounds of this library and museum, though. His boyhood home is actually right on the grounds of this library and museum as well. So you get a lot of that. Gerald Ford in Michigan, this is his burial site right up here, right next door to where his presidential museum is. It's in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as a matter of fact. So it just goes to show President George H.W. Bush, this cemetery, it's actually on the grounds of Texas A&M University. His presidential library and museum is right on the grounds of the university. As a matter of fact, I stood in the parking lot of the library and museum, and directly across the parking lot was the Texas A&M football stadium. So, I mean, it's literally right there. And then, I've been asked by people, well, why, the two Adams, John and John Quincy, father and son, they're in the same place. Why wouldn't the Bushes do that? It's a good question. I think it really is just a matter of preference. George H.W. Bush's ranch was more located near the Houston area, and that's kind of centrally located to where Texas A&M University is. Whereas George W. Bush's ranch is actually more up in the Dallas area. So I think that is why George W. Bush's presidential library is in Dallas and he's not down there with his father, is because it's just kind of more centrally located to where they actually lived. So, but beautiful. I was very surprised. My brother, who born and raised in New Jersey, about 4 years ago, moved to Austin, Texas, his entire family. So I was in Texas 3 times during all of my travels, and I got to stop in and visit with them, spend a couple days with them. And this was the only gravesite that anybody was with me. My nephew, Jake, who's 13 years old, and my brother, Michael, actually visited George H.W. Bush's gravesite with me the day that I went. And we were, all three of us were struck at how truly beautiful it very well done it was. So, but just so everybody knows, yes, it's beautiful looking and it's very, very nice and well taken care of, but there's no giant buildings like Lincoln and Harding and Grant. It's much different now. It's much, much different. So we went from buried on their own homes grounds to kind of plain and boring to these giant buildings and tombs and mausoleums. And now we go to this presidential library museum thing and very conservative gravesites, very, very conservative gravesites. So now I'm going to get into the fun stuff, right? Okay, so everybody said, well, what were your favorites? What did you see? Tell me the things that you saw. I was going to do top tens on all these lists, but then I realized that top tens might be a little long-winded and I might have people start falling asleep. So I figured I'd just narrow it down to 5. And what I'm doing here, anybody that read the Asbury Park Press article, they had me actually do a top 5 list for presidents, a top 5 list for vice presidents, and then a top 5 list of just obscure places that I thought people should visit. And Jerry Carino, the person that wrote that article, he asked me basically to be Frommer's. He wanted me to give you the Frommer's guidebook, what you could go pick up in Barnes and Noble and read about, that every guidebook is going to tell you. They're going to tell you Grant in New York City and Kennedy in Arlington and Lincoln. They're going to tell you the common ones that people mostly visit. I will give a disclaimer. A couple of those guys might be on my top 5 list just because it was amazing. There are stories to go with them, though. But these lists that I'm about to show you are my personal opinion. These were my personal favorites. They may not be yours. They may not be the general public's personal favorites, but I'll try to explain to you why they were my favorites as well. So obviously, right here, you see Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was written and signed by all the delegates, of course. My son and I just went here a couple months ago, and they were given tours, and we were actually the only 2 inside of the building. Yet again, we got very lucky. And of course, this was a very special moment for myself because it's the first time I had ever been inside of Independence Hall, my son's first time. And it was very, very interesting to me because I had already seen 53 of the 56 men's grave sites that signed that document. So very, very interesting to me. So number 5, we're going to do kind of a countdown 5 to 1. Number 5 is actually Samuel Huntington. He was a signer from Connecticut. He died 1796. He was 64 years old. He's buried at the old Norwich Town Burying Ground in Norwich, Connecticut. I'll show you the pictures here in a second. The very cool thing about this gravesite in the cemetery is Benedict Arnold. Yes, that Benedict Arnold. His mother is actually buried at this gravesite. And there's actually a marker that you can pass by when you're walking through that shows where her gravesite is. And it actually does explain what I explained to my friend that day of Benedict Arnold stood right here when they were burying his mother. So, and he was already not a liked man. He was already a traitor at the time. So very interesting that he stood there when there was plenty of people looking to basically catch him and hang him at the current time. So very interesting, very, very cool part of history. So you'll see here, I always added a picture, or at least the depiction of what they thought these gentlemen looked like. Um, Huntington was very cool because you see down here in the bottom left, you see these. Whoop, what did I do? There it goes. You see down here in the bottom left, you actually see the actual cemetery is kind of wide open. You had to walk through this part of the cemetery and come to a little bridge that was over a creek. And when you went over that little bridge, all of a sudden it opened up into what you see on the bottom here, this giant tomb of Samuel Huntington's. It was almost like he was by himself. It looked like something out of it was like Aesop's Fables. It was really, really cool. It was very just this neat, unique kind of area. So he's obviously inside of there. Here's a panoramic picture that I took at the gravesite. The creek is kind of actually right down here is that little bridge that I spoke about that you cross over. And when you cross over, it just opens up into this big little hillside tomb and mausoleum of Samuel Huntington's. I thought it was really cool, really unique. Again, as you can see, take a look around. There's not another living soul around. So that was the other special part of this for me. Was I really got to have all this to myself. So that was really cool to see his. He was probably my fifth favorite from the Declaration guys. Number 4 was Arthur Middleton. Arthur Middleton was actually a signer from South Carolina. He died in 1787. He was only 44 years old, and even for the time, that was pretty young. He's buried at Middleton Place grounds. The thing that I love, you'll notice a theme of a couple South Carolina people on this list. South Carolina is amazingly steeped in history. Not only is there a lot of historical things down there, it really feels when you're driving onto some of these old plantations like you just did a time warp back to 1787. It looks like these places are untouched. You have the Spanish moss hanging off the trees. It's everything you would envision about that southern charm and those southern plantations. He's buried right on his plantation. The really fun, cool thing about Arthur Middleton, you'll kind of notice that's his house right there up there. You'll even notice on this bottom picture, the plaque, notice the flash. Well, that's because I got there right as the sun was going down. And I actually, for lack of a better term, I think I pissed a curator off, to be completely honest with you, because these grounds are open to the public, but I'm sure they close at some point, during the evening. So I had no idea really where his tomb was, which you actually see down here in the bottom left. So I pulled my rental car all the way up to this house, and I get out and I go behind it, and it sits right on this like lake, river, beautiful. You could hear the birds. It was amazing. I could hear the crickets already. And then finally, I'm kind of like giving up because it's really about to get dark. And then I turn to my left and I go down this little dirt path, and lo and behold, there's Arthur Middleton. And I heard while I was standing taking pictures of his gravesite, I actually heard something off to my distance, and it was somebody coming and very, very violently slamming and closing and locking the gate behind me. And when I finally got back to my car to leave, it looked like some sort of curator or something from the grounds, and I guess she was a little aggravated that I was there at that time of night or whatever it was. But so it's just these are kind of the reasons that some of these things are my favorites, because there's a little fun, silly story to go with them as well. But it was really cool, honestly. This is a beautiful, beautiful spot. Very, very typical of these guys, again, to be buried on their plantations, very much just like our first presidents were. These guys were buried on their homes, their plantations. And the sad thing is, and I will use the word sad, is I don't think many people visit these places. They're so forgotten. I'm sure if you asked the majority of people who Arthur Middleton is, they'd say who? They have no idea. So pretty sad, but definitely interesting as well. Number 3 would be John Penn, signer from North Carolina. He was 47 when he died. So his original burial site is near Oxford, North Carolina. He was reinferred to the National Military Park in Greensboro with other North Carolina signers. But the really cool thing about his is his original site, as you see right here, original grave, is literally in the middle of the woods. I tell you, in the middle of the woods. I'm not just saying, he was kind of in the woods. He was in the middle of the woods. I had to go down a logging road for about 15 miles of a dirt logging road to come to finally find where his original grave was. As you see this top picture up here, top left, I had to literally hike in to see it. Everybody will ask me, what the heck is that little stone in the middle right next to that? Believe it or not, that's actually a slave cemetery right next to him, and that was a marker for where one of his slaves was buried. So his graveyard, where he was originally buried, maybe about 50 to 75 yards from that, there was this slave cemetery. And I tell you, it was one of the only times that the hairs on my arms stood up a little bit, because here I am in the middle of the woods. I'm not near civilization, and I'm just sprawling around these old grave sites of, old slaves and old declaration signers. And it was very, very interesting, that's for sure. And then you see the last two pictures over here. This is a monument in that National Military Park. It's a historic park there in North Carolina, where all of the Declaration signers from North Carolina were re-interned. They're underneath where this monument is, but it is actually a pretty nice monument, and you can see John Penn's name is, etched into the side of that monument. But I did want to show the reason he's one of my favorites is because his original gravesite was one of the coolest things that you could ever see. So it was very, very interesting. Very hard to find, though. I will tell you that. It took a lot of research. Number two, the Benjamin Harrison. The thing that's awesome about him, he's actually the father of William Henry Harrison, the president, and he's the great-grandfather of Benjamin Harrison, the president. So could you imagine one family that has a Declaration signer, a president, and then another president? I mean, that's unbelievable. That's truly, anybody that says, well, the Bush family or the Adams family, they don't have that. They may have the presidents. They don't have a Declaration signer to go with it. The reason this is one of my favorites, not only because of the history, again, he's down in Virginia on a beautiful plantation of his, but you'll actually see here this top right picture, Berkeley's House and Gardens closed today, posted private property, and you see this long dirt road? Well, that's the road you would actually travel down to get to this middle picture. That's the estate, the plantation that he's buried on those grounds. Well, not only was that closed, there was actually a giant tree down right in the middle of the beginning of that road that you couldn't drive past. So I had gone all the way there, and I said, you know what, heck with it. I'm parking my car and I'm hoofing it. I'm going to walk down this 1.5 mile dirt road. Who the heck knows? I'm in Virginia. People are probably going to be chasing me out of here. It's private property. So I went all the way down, no issues, didn't really hear or see anybody. And then I got to see right on this river, Benjamin Harrison's gravesite, which was awesome. It's really cool. It's a little family graveyard. And as I'm walking back and I'm just about to where this plantation house is and I'm about to start my trek down to my car, I see two giant dogs running at me, and they're not on leashes and they're not behind fences. So literally my heart was in my throat. And I'm not afraid to say that I think that I, soiled myself a little bit because I'm a dog person, but two strange dogs, you don't know what's going to happen, right? Well, long story short, the one was, he was friendly, but he didn't really want anything to do with me. The other one was a black lab. This black lab carried a stick the entire 2-mile trek down the road to my car with me. He literally became my little friend, my buddy for the entire trip. As I threw him the stick, he'd fetch it and come back to me. So I was very nervous about walking onto this property because I really wasn't supposed to, I'll be honest. But it was a really great story, and it became something that I'll never forget, especially because I thought I was going to get attacked by dogs. That would have been a really interesting story. Hey, I went to go see Declaration signers' gravesites, and I also got attacked by dogs. So that would have been quite an interesting twist. But it didn't happen that way, but it was still a really cool place to see. Very, very unique. And I just love the fact that he, is obviously the father of William Henry and the great-grandfather of Benjamin. I think that's a really, really cool thing. And then number one, this is the most unique thing you guys will probably see throughout this entire presentation. Richard Henry Lee was a signer from Virginia. He died when he was 62 in 1794. You see it says buried on the Burnt House Fields Lee family estate. No, it's not, because there's no estate. The estate is long gone. And when I had the GPS coordinates to get there, I started going down this dirt road, and I was literally in the middle of the cornfield. If anybody has ever seen the movie Field of Dreams, I literally thought ghost baseball players were going to come out and meet me. As you see the gravesite up here, you see all this corn up here. you're going to see on a picture on the next slide, a panoramic that's really going to bring that to full life. So the really cool thing about this, it's literally in the middle of a cornfield, in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. You drive down a dirt road, and then this just brick walled, it's a family cemetery. And Richard Henry Lee, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, is laying right there. I bet you that you will never find another person that you know that has ever visited Richard Henry Lee's gravesite, because it was the most unique, out of the way, out of the ordinary place that I've ever seen. It was truly amazing. It may even be my favorite grave that I visited, even regarding presidents and everything. I mean, it was just that incredible. As you'll see from this next panoramic picture, it's literally in the middle of a cornfield. So it was really unique. You can see my rental car there on the bottom left over there. And these corn, these stalks were 10, 12 feet high. You couldn't see over them. It was very unique. It was really cool. I loved it. I thought it was just interesting that I bet you if 5 people a year go and visit that probably would be a lot. So I thought that was really interesting. So that's my top 5 Declaration signers list. Then I did top 5 vice presidents list. These pictures that I'm showing here, they're not actually the 5. These 5 didn't make my list. They're kind of just honorable mentions. I just was showing. The reason I wanted to show these pictures, these 2 right here, this one in the middle and this one in the top right, those are the 2 vice presidents buried in New Jersey. In the middle here, you have Aaron Burr. Up here in the top right, you have Garrett Hobart. Garrett Hobart was actually one of William McKinley's vice presidents, but Hobart died in office, and then McKinley had to replace him. Now, if he would have lived, we would have had President Garrett Hobart, because William McKinley was assassinated. So that's also some fascinating things. It kind of goes along with during his first term, Lincoln's vice president's name was Hannibal Hamlin, and he changed him in his second term for Andrew Johnson because of the Southern, tie with the Civil War. But could you imagine if we would have had a President Hannibal Hamlin? I mean, just that name, it would have been very interesting. I always found that kind of fascinating. So these are just some other ones. Elbridge Gerry, he's actually right down here in the bottom right. He's the only vice president. He's also a Declaration signer as well. He's the only one buried in Washington, D.C. He's at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington. And if anybody, well, I'm sure you have, if you listen to the news, especially recently, has heard of gerrymandering, that was named after Elbridge Gerry. So that is the reason we came up with that term. So the gerrymandering, that is all because of Mr. Gerry down there. This one was a cool one. James Sherman, Schoolcraft Sherman. He was a vice president. The reason that's cool is I did that in late April. You see the snow on the ground. That was actually up in Utica, New York. The cemetery was closed. I had to find a little opening in the fence and walk about 3 miles in the snow. So it was a very cold, interesting morning. So I just thought I would add that one in there. So my top 5 vice presidents, the way I did this for you guys was, of course, I tell you what number vice president they were and who they were the vice president underneath. This is John Cabell Breckinridge. He was vice president under James Buchanan. He's buried in Lexington, Kentucky. He was a Kentucky boy through and through. The reason that I found his kind of interesting is a very plain gravesite, as you can see, but you see this giant statue they built for him that's literally, as you see, like right next to where his gravesite is. That is the only time I've ever seen that, president or vice president. I guess they think so highly of their Kentucky boy down there that they decided to build a monument and a statue to him right next to where he's buried in his gravesite. But I found it very unique, and it was very interesting to me, so that's why he made my list. And then you have George Clinton. He actually was one of only 2 men to serve as vice president under 2 different presidents. He was vice president under Jefferson and Madison. He's from New York. He was the first governor of New York, actually. He's in a very small town not far from Woodstock, New York. Kingston, New York is the name of the town. Loved his cemetery. It's on an old church grounds. You'll see here, beautiful old church. I just thought it was really cool and unique. Maybe it's because I was there all by myself. And then, of course, when I was standing there, of course, I had to take a quick video because the church bells started to chime when I was standing there, and I thought that it was very, very unique and interesting, and I loved it. Um, it just was really cool, and I found it fascinating too that he's one of only two men to ever serve as vice president twice under two different presidents. I think that's pretty unique. And then number three, we get on to John Colwell Calhoun. Guess what? He's the other one to serve twice under two different presidents. He's under John Quincy and, of course, Andrew Jackson, which is interesting because him and Andrew Jackson actually hated each other, which is quite interesting. So he's buried down in South Carolina. The reason I chose this is because this was another graveyard that was actually closed due to COVID, but I somehow made my way in to see the gravesite. And the cool thing about this was Charleston, South Carolina was one of my favorite cities that I've ever been to in my life. And I'd never been there before this. It is just beautifully steeped in history. This is called Calhoun's gravesite. It's a pretty impressive, cool looking thing. But it's just this old historical cemetery next to this old historical church. And if anybody hasn't ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, and you're a history buff, go. It is amazing. It's just truly incredible. The old building and architecture on almost every building in the city is just beautiful. A lot of people will tell you, go to Savannah, Georgia. I've been to both. Charleston is better than Savannah, Georgia. Just a little hint. And more people go to Savannah. So, but it's both beautiful. Very, very, that Southern charm. Just loved it. I loved being there. It was really cool. And my number two vice president that I thought was really cool was Richard Mentor Johnson. He was vice president under Martin Van Buren. He's in Frankfort, Kentucky. The reason I loved his so much, as you'll see here, not only was his grave, I mean, this big tall obelisk was really cool. It had his photo like etched into the side of it. This graveyard in Frankfort sits up on top of this giant mountain hill. And when you actually are standing there, you actually can look right across the river and see the state capitol building of Kentucky. So it was really, really cool, really beautiful. He's actually buried like maybe 50 yards from Daniel Boone, which I thought was kind of fun. So that was kind of cool. But very, very unique, very interesting, very nice, just a nice representation for a vice president, which is pretty unique and pretty rare. And my number one favorite actually was William Rufus Devane King. He was vice president under Franklin Pierce. He's actually in Selma, Alabama. And the reason I loved him so much is because, as you'll see here, there's literally Spanish moss growing off the trees right in front of his tomb. It's just this, again, it makes you feel like you just stepped back into like the 1840s or something. And you're just standing there you just feel like you're a part of history when you're standing there. I can't really explain it, the feeling that you get. And again, I mean, anytime you think Southern plantation, the Spanish moss hanging off the trees, it's just this visual I think most people get. And the fact that it's literally right outside of his tomb, it was really unique. I never expected to find too many interesting things in Alabama, I'll be honest, but there was a few things that I was very interested in. This was one of them. So that was probably my favorite vice presidential gravesite to actually see. Moving along, of course, we have the presidents of the United States and who are my favorites. And this, again, these four gentlemen did not make my list. They're just honorable mentions. William Henry Harrison, because of my private tour. That's Jefferson, my favorite. That's Lyndon Johnson on his ranch in Texas. And this is actually down here. That's actually Herbert Hoover, who, for being such a lackluster president, he actually has a beautiful, beautiful gravesite, which I really enjoyed. He's over there in Iowa, where he's from. So I really did enjoy that. So my list of presidents, 5-1. Rutherford B. Hayes, 19th president. The reason I loved Rutherford B. Hayes, now I do have to just briefly tell you guys, this list changed just the other day. This list actually had a different order to it. But I actually just went back up to Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts this weekend to see Constitution signers. And I stopped by and saw a president for the second time, and he rapidly moved up my list, but I will get to that. So Rutherford B. Hayes, this was a really cool place. There is this building, as you'll see, it says the Museum Library. That was not there, though. That was not built there when Hayes was alive. That came after him. I think they kind of built it in the vein of trying to just maintain presidential libraries and that sort of thing. But this was really cool because you can see here all these like pine trees and all these. It looks like you're in the forest, and it really was like that. It was literally like a park. It was like a state park that I was in, and you walk through these grounds, and then all of a sudden you come to this giant, tomb area of President Hayes, and it was just really cool. I'm a big time nature person, so obviously living in Montana for 6 years. So I mean, I love this. I thought it was really cool and unique. Something about it just really struck me. Number 4, believe it or not, he did make the list. George H.W. Bush. There was something beautiful about his gravesite, and you'll see more now. This is the Presidential Library, statue of him. These are the grounds. This bridge right here is actually the entrance to get to his grave, and then this picture right down here next to the building, that's the little path you walk to get to his gravesite. I mean, again, just beautifully done. Me and my brother and nephew had the whole place to ourselves. It was really, really special. My nephew, being 13 years old, he's a baseball player. He had a baseball hat on. And I told him before he approaches the president's grave, he needs to take that hat off. And he looked at me like I had 6 heads. And then he realized very quickly that I was actually very serious. So, one thing I always made sure of is to be very respectful of these places. These are people that were an integral part of our history, whether they're Declaration signers, presidents, whoever they were. Even if they're presidents in our lifetime, they could be people you don't like, but they still were the president of our country, and they deserve respect, and they deserve, everybody to take where they're buried and their resting places respectfully as well. Sadly, I did see some of the opposite during my travels, so that is a sad thing. But I always made sure that I was very respectful, no matter where I was visiting these men. So I love that. That was a great one. Number 3 was actually, it is Kennedy. I know, big deal. There's the Fromer's Guide. Oh, come on, you're going to give us Kennedy. Listen, growing up with my father, who's a Kennedy buff and a Kennedy assassination buff, it's really hard. I visited Arlington. This is not the first time I've seen Kennedy's gravesite. I've seen it several times. There's just something very emotional when you're standing at Kennedy's gravesite. You feel the tragedy, you feel the history. When I just went there, Arlington reopened to the public about a month ago. When I went there originally, Kennedy's gravesite was still closed because I guess they were afraid of crowds. Well, I just went, they just reopened Kennedy's gravesite about a week ago, and I went back. And as you see, I had the entire gravesite to myself. This never happens. For anybody that's ever visited Kennedy's gravesite, there's always people around. There's always chatter. You always hear people. The graveyard, the cemetery opened at 8 a.m. I stood where you see these pictures at about 8:06 a.m. right after it opened. The video I'm going to show you next is one of my most special treasured things that I took on all of my journey, because you don't get Kennedy's gravesite to yourself with a flag in the background flying at half mast because of COVID, and just the pure silence of the morning was truly incredible to me. And very, very touching, very special to me. And I'd be hard pressed not to put him on my list of the top 5 of the most special presidential grave sites to go see, because it truly is a very special place. So moving on from Kennedy, unfortunately, there is going to be another one of the Fromers on this list, so be prepared. Number 2 is the guy that jumped up this past weekend. He was actually number 5 on my list. And if you read the Asbury Park article, you're going to probably say to me, teacher, you're contradicting yourself. You said that this was one of the most unimpressive grave sites. It is. But Calvin Coolidge's gravesite is one of the coolest things you will ever see in your life. And it speaks volumes to the man that Calvin Coolidge was. And the reason I say that is because Calvin Coolidge is, as you see from this top picture, right around the corner from Killington Mountain in Vermont. He's actually only a half mile from his birth house, and it's the same house that he was sworn in as president at about 2 a.m. by his father, who was a justice of the peace, who was actually able to swear him in. Warren Harding died in office. He had a heart attack. Coolidge was his vice president, so he became president. And the great thing about Calvin Coolidge was truly, that he had that motto, keep it cool with Coolidge. He was just a very mild-mannered man from all historians' perspectives. The two stories I love about Coolidge, and it really speaks to the simplistic nature of his gravesite. His gravesite, as you see here, his headstone is really no bigger than any of his other family members. It's very plain and simple. It's literally right on the side of a roadway, right a half mile from where he was born and sworn in. And my two favorite Coolidge stories are when he was sworn in by his father about 2 o'clock in the morning. He took the oath of presidency and he went back to bed. So that kind of shows you about Coolidge. And another great thing is they said he didn't speak hardly any words. He just didn't talk much. There was a dinner and a gala happening at the White House, and a woman was, visiting, and she was a guest. She was sitting next to President Coolidge, and she leaned over to him and said, "So I have a bet with a friend that I can get you to say more than 3 words tonight." And Coolidge smiled, and he leaned over to her and said, "You lose." And that was it. So I love that. And it just kind of shows his gravesite in this area. You're in these beautiful Vermont mountains. His simplistic nature really does go over to his gravesite. It's just so simplistic, but there's a beauty in it. There's just a stark beauty in his gravesite. And I loved it. I love the area of it. So he jumped up quite rapidly this past weekend with me. And number one, I'm sure it's probably not a big shock to anybody, is of course the 16th president of the United States. If I could tell anybody to go anywhere historical to see somebody's gravesite, go to Springfield, Illinois. It's magical, it's special, and I have an even more special story that goes with it. So these top 2 pictures, this is the holding place, the holding tomb where Lincoln was first held when he got there. He was held here for about 6 months before they were finished building his huge tomb and memorial. You'll actually see behind the original holding place, you see the tall looking thing through the trees. That's actually his monument. So it's right down the hill. And then right here, you can see down the hill from his actual gravesite, you see a headstone with some coins on it. That's an old military tradition. People leave coins on these historical figures' gravesites. They actually had to bury Lincoln here a couple times early on because of grave robbers, people that were trying to come vandalize and steal Abraham Lincoln's body. So they had to try to trick people and place him in other places so nobody would be able to be successful. So here's the fun story quickly about Lincoln's tomb. It was closed for a long time because of COVID. It finally opened. Perfect. I'm going. So I make my route out to Illinois. Now, I am actually at the Herbert Hoover's grave in Iowa, and then I went to the Field of Dreams in Iowa where they filmed that movie and saw that. I've seen it before, but I visited there again. And I realized, okay, well, it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon for me to get to Lincoln's grave. No, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sorry. To me to get to Lincoln's graves, solid 2.5 hours. I'm just going to go straight there now from Iowa over to Springfield, Illinois. Well, I got to Springfield, Illinois in Oak Ridge Cemetery about 3:50 in the afternoon, 10 to 4. Well, I didn't know that because you have to go in, you see this tall thing, you see this doorway here that has these, hazard cones in front of it. This is indoors, and because of COVID, they're only allowing a certain amount of people to go inside the tomb at once. Well, they were giving kind of like tours. Well, the last tour was at 4 o'clock. I got there at 3:50, and I just signed up for the last tour of the day. Well, there comes out a tour guide at 4 o'clock, and he's talking to this group of people. There's probably, I'd say, about 20 of us total. That was the only place I really saw people. But I was the only solo one. I was the only person that was alone. So, they were letting about 5 or 6 people in at a time, sets of family, groups of families. I'm looking around the grounds and just kind of, admiring things. Finally, the gentleman says, "Sir, since you're alone, you can go in." Well, of course, they ask you to wear your mask at all times. Now, when you first go in, there's this kind of open room, and it has a statue of Lincoln, and then you turn to your right and you go down this long, marble, beautiful hallway. Okay. And I realized right away when I stepped in the tomb, oh crap, I'm alone. So I whispered to the tour guide that's standing near the doorway. I said, "Hey, can I take my mask off so I can take some selfies without a mask?" And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, "I don't care what you do." And I realized at that moment that I was going to have President Lincoln's tomb all to myself. That is another thing. Don't expect that if you go visit Lincoln's tomb in another year or two. There will be plenty of people in here with you. It's the most popular presidential gravesite. Very close second is Kennedy, of course. So I walked down this long marble hallway, and the reason that I really started to get a feeling of things was because I had seen where Lincoln was born in Kentucky. Yes, Kentucky. A lot of people think it's Illinois, but he was born in Kentucky, where he grew up in Kentucky in a log cabin. I had just seen in Springfield, Illinois, his home that he lived at in Springfield. I had seen where he was assassinated in Ford's Theater. I had seen his assassin's gravesite. I've followed all the route of his assassin's escape route. And now I'm coming full circle and seeing where probably the most iconic president of our history is buried. And it just, this feeling, this overwhelming feeling of nostalgia and history struck me as I'm walking down this long hallway. And then I turn to my left and I see the tomb of Abraham Lincoln, which is right here on the bottom. And as you see, there's nobody in there. Right across from him is where Mary Todd Lincoln is, and his two young sons that died at young ages. Robert Todd Lincoln, who was his son that actually lived until he was 70s or almost 80. He's actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was the only one of the children to actually have a long, full life. And I got to stand at Abraham Lincoln's tomb by myself. It was probably the most amazing moment that I had throughout this whole journey. To see the way our country is so divided right now, and there's so much angst regarding so many issues. And of course, over these last 7-8 months, we've had a lot of racial and civil rights issues with police and that sort of thing. And to just stand here during the height of when all of this is going on around the country, a global pandemic and all this division in our country, it was quite a special moment. It was quite interesting to me, and I implore anybody to go visit this because it's truly unique. It's truly amazing. It's probably the most beautiful presidential gravesite. Truly, President Lincoln is actually 10 feet directly underneath this, not 6 feet. He's actually 10 feet underneath. And it's just it's a beautiful place. It really is a very, very, very special place. So that is my list of the tops, and then I'll give you a quick top 5 disappointing ones that don't waste your time, I should say. Even though they're historic and cool, you might not want to waste your time with it. I hate to do this, but number 5 is our president from New Jersey. He's one of my favorite presidents, not just because he's from New Jersey. President Cleveland was actually a man of great integrity. He was a very morally sound person, and he was actually a pretty good president. Some things went wrong in his presidency, just like always, but he was a good man. But unfortunately, that's it. That's all that there is to President Cleveland's gravesite in Princeton. There's nothing to it. And as a matter of fact, he's one of the only presidents that has no mention of him being president of the United States on his grave. He's one of the only ones. In fact, he may be the only one from off the top of my head. So it's pretty basic, unfortunately. I've gone and seen it about 4 times over the last 8 months, but it's pretty basic. The cool thing about it, the one cool thing about it is right next to him is his daughter, Ruth, and she was a very famous baby Ruth. And yes, the candy bar was actually named after her. So the Baby Ruth candy bar. So that's a fun little thing. And she is buried right next to her father in the graveyard. So that's cool, but it is pretty underwhelming, I must say. Number 4, I know I'm terrible. Another one from New Jersey, Richard Stockton. It's cool because it's Richard Stockton, And it's cool because you're at this old Dutch meeting ground, type cemetery, but they don't know where the hell he is. Literally, this plaque tells you that he's somewhere inside of here, but they literally, even like the record keepers of these grounds, they don't know which plot is his. This speaks volumes of what I touched on earlier about how forgotten these men are. How do we not know where one of the men responsible for signing the most important document in the history of our country is buried? We just don't know. And this goes to show the forgotten history that you really feel when you visit these grave sites. It's just truly forgotten. So unfortunately, I had to put two New Jersey guys on there. I feel bad. It's my home state, of course, but it's just the truth. Number 3 was a man named Alvin Barkley. He was actually Truman's vice president. He's buried all the way in Paducah, Kentucky, which, when I tell you, I promise you, no one's flocking to go to Paducah. There's nothing there. And the interesting thing about Alvin Barkley, he was actually the oldest vice president ever in office. Now we have the oldest president ever elected, Donald Trump, and whoever wins in a couple weeks, or I should say next week, is going to be the oldest elected. But he still to this day is the oldest vice president ever to hold office of vice presidency. And as you can see, pretty darn plain. There's nothing that even says vice president on his gravesite. Just says Barkley. Am I visiting Charles Barkley? Am I visiting the vice president? I don't know what's happening here. So it was pretty plain. It was cool that it was so out of the way in this little town in Kentucky, but in the same respect, would have been nice if it was a little more impressive to drive all those miles and then see this. It was a little underwhelming. Number 2 is actually Spiro Agnew, who was vice president under Nixon. He's buried right in Maryland, stone throw from us. He's from Maryland, and he is a terrible gravesite. This little plaque is it. That is it. That is Spiro Agnew's gravesite. And I think why it's like this, again, no mention of him being vice president anywhere on here. Spiro Agnew obviously was caught up in a lot of scandal. Not only when he was vice president, even after his vice presidency, a lot of corruption, a lot of money laundering. So unfortunately, he had a very tainted reputation. So I don't really think, and believe it or not, he only died, I believe, 1996. So in all of our lifetime, of course, he just was not very revered, and it's very evident in his gravesite. It's very plain, not much to it. And number 1 for me, believe it or not, was the Georgia Declaration signers. They are all buried together, George Walton, Lyman Hall, and Button Gwinnett. The reason that this infuriates me, this gravesite, is because they don't even know how old 2 of these men were when they died. So these are 2 men that signed the Declaration of Independence, and they're like, oh, how old were they when they died? I don't know. You tell me. Button Gwinnett, they think he was either 41 or 42. Okay, that's only a year. But George Walton, he could be anywhere from 54 to 63 years old. There's so much historic discrepancy, they don't know. The only cool thing about this is I will show you. Here's a picture of the 3 men, or at least what they think the 3 men. Actually, Button Gwinnett, who's here, that's what they think he looked like. The historians have no idea what he really looked like. He's actually also, for people that like to collect memorabilia and signatures, he's the scarcest and most rare historical signature there is. He died when he was only about 41 years old, very young. He didn't sign anything except for that very famous document in 1776. And if you found his autograph, an autograph of his, something that was signed of his, went at a Christie's auction in New York City a few years ago for $400,000. So unless you're pretty rich, you're not going to get a Button Gwinnett, autograph. So the cool thing about Gwinnett, though, is this up here is in Savannah, Georgia, and that, white-looking obelisk monument, they found what they think is bone remains of Button Gwinnett underneath there, but they can't verify it. So they think that he might be buried there, but they're not sure. And then when you go over to Augusta, Georgia, yes, right down the street from where the Masters golf tournament takes place every year. And yes, I did go to Augusta National to take a look at it. there is this monument. The three signers from Georgia are buried underneath this monument. And you might say to me, well, TJ, that don't look that bad. It's a big, tall monument, but it's in the middle of the road. This road that you see here, you see there's no traffic now because I went there in like May in the middle of COVID when everything was closed. This is actually the municipal complex of Augusta, Georgia. This is a very busy roadway. So these three gentlemen who were very responsible for, forming our country, they're buried underneath this giant monument with nothing really, there's nothing to it. It's just in the middle of a roadway. I bet you there are so many, not people that live there, they probably know, but people that visit Augusta, they probably drive past this and are like, oh, look at that big tall thing. They have no idea they're driving past three men that are buried underneath this thing that signed the Declaration. So it was very underwhelming, very disappointing to me that that's the way we remember these men. So I'm wrapping this up here in a minute, but I did want to show this because I thought it would be a really kind of cool contrast. I saw so many things. And the one thing that was fascinating to me that I did see was where all of our four presidents were assassinated and where their assassins' grave sites were. These are the four presidents that were assassinated: Kennedy, Lincoln, McKinley, and Garfield. Of course, Kennedy and Lincoln are the most famous, but very interesting to me. Of course, Lee Harvey Oswald was the one who assassinated Kennedy. I know there's a lot of conspiracies, but let's face facts. History books say it's Oswald. And he is buried in Fort Worth, Texas, and I will show you next. Dealey Plaza in Dallas is where the assassination took place, famously, of course. And Oswald, as you see up here, this is his gravesite, and it's just a little plaque that says Oswald. For many, many, many years, Lee Harvey Oswald was buried under an unmarked grave. A lot of people thought at first that he was buried in an unmarked grave because they didn't want people to vandalize it. That's not true. It's because Marina Oswald, his widow, had no money she was they were a very poor family. They had no money to obtain a headstone or anything for Lee. So it wasn't until very many years later that finally the family just put a very little tiny plaque that says Oswald. So that's where Lee Oswald's buried. And of course, right here is Dealey Plaza in Dallas. Right where I'm standing here, there's an X in the middle of the road. That is where the fatal headshot, anybody that's seen that horrific Zapruder film of Kennedy being assassinated, that's where that final fatal headshot took place. This is the Texas School Book Depository, where, Oswald shot from. That's a view from down where he shot from. And these are just pictures from the grassy knoll. Of course, the grassy knoll is infamous for being very surrounded by conspiracy theories of someone shooting from that angle as well. And a couple other pictures I wanted to just quickly show you guys. This is actually Lee Harvey Oswald's boarding house. After Oswald shot Kennedy, he went back to this boarding house. He grabbed a pistol out of his room and quickly fled the house and started walking. He walked. I actually parked in front of Lee Oswald's boarding house and did the actual route that Lee took that day. And he finally made it to the corner of 10th and Patton, where he was confronted by Officer J.D. Tippit, because Oswald fit a description of who the assassin might be. And Oswald shot and killed Officer J.D. Tippit right here where I'm standing on the corner of 10th and Patton. Oswald then continued to the Dallas State Theater, where he was arrested. That's where the cops found him and arrested him. These other pictures here, this is actually Love Field, where Kennedy came in that day, the Love Field, and got in the motorcade procession. This here is Parkland Hospital. That's where Kennedy was rushed to and died inevitably. He was pronounced dead at Parkland, even though he was pretty much dead, obviously, in the limousine that day in Dallas. So, and these are just other buildings. This is actually the Dallas Tech's building, where Oswald was shot and killed by Jack Ruby when he was coming out of the building that day. He was shot and killed there. And these are some famous pictures of where Lee Oswald used to live at another house in Dallas. There's a very famous picture of Lee Oswald holding a rifle from earlier on in the year. That was actually taken right here at this fence, that famous picture of Lee holding the rifle. And then, of course, we have Leon Kolzig, and he's the one that assassinated McKinley up in Buffalo, New York. Very cool thing about here was, you see, he was arrested, of course. They don't know where he's buried, but this right here where it says Fort Hill Remains, he was sent to the Fort Hill prison, And there's about 20 to 30 remains of convicted felons that are buried in this mass grave, and Leon is one of them. And it's basically in this very small little roadside cemetery in upstate New York. Um, not many people even know he's there. Where you see here where I am, this is actually where the Pan Am building stood in Buffalo, where McKinley was assassinated. It's right in the middle of a neighborhood now. The building has been gone for many, many decades. It's no longer in existence. And then, of course, this is the site here in Buffalo where McKinley was taken to a house and actually later died at. And then, of course, we have Charles Guiteau. He's the one that killed Garfield. He's not buried. He's the one of the four assassins that's not actually buried. Guiteau, actually, his brain was donated to science. It's actually at the National Medical Archives in Washington. And it's not on display to the public, but they do have it. There are pictures you could probably Google and see of it, as gross and silly as that is. But they did it for studies, to study how mentally deranged this man was. So what you see up here actually is good old Long Branch, New Jersey. This empty lot that you see, that's where President Garfield died. He died in Long Branch. President Garfield was shot. If you see here where I'm standing outside of this building, it was in Washington, D.C. It was actually the Baltimore Potomac Railroad Station back then. It no longer is in existence. Sadly, the only thing that exists are these couple signs to indicate where the assassination took place. Here's the terrible tragedy of it. That sits on where the National Mall is. These signs are being taken away next year. They were only up for 5 years. So there's literally going to be no indication of where one of our presidents was even assassinated, which boggles my mind. But that is where it took place. So this empty lot, Garfield had a house right in Long Branch, New Jersey. He loved the ocean. He loved being down there. After he was shot, he didn't die from the gunshot. President Garfield didn't die for about 90 days after he was shot. And the reason he died was he died of sepsis. He died of an infection of his blood because the doctors who immediately worked on him in the railroad station when he was shot, they didn't sanitize. So they think that he got infected by their hands and their tools, and he died a very unfortunate, slow, painful death right where this lot is in Long Branch, New Jersey. You see this picture of this little tiny tea house. It's called the Church of the Presidents. That's also right in Long Branch, New Jersey. That's the only standing building that was in existence back on the day that Garfield died in Long Branch. And that sits on the Church of the Presidents, which is right in Long Branch, New Jersey. And this is just some other pictures of the Church of the Presidents and where Garfield was assassinated. There's a statue to him, too, right along the boardwalk in Long Branch, New Jersey. And then, of course, last but not least, probably one of the most famous things in history, John Wilkes Booth assassinating Lincoln. We all know where that took place in Ford's Theater in Washington. This is actually Booth's grave in Baltimore, Maryland. A lot of people have the distinction that in the top right here, you see this unmarked headstone with coins on it. They think that's where John is. They are wrong. It's a very common misconception. If you see in this picture here, this empty part of grass behind where the obelisk is, that's actually where John is buried underneath. It's not marked, but it's definitely not here either. On the bottom here, this is Ford's Theater and the Peterson House right across the street where Lincoln was carried and died the next morning in. That's me and my son outside of there. My son is fascinated with Lincoln. He wants to go see the inside of these places, but of course they're closed right now due to COVID. And then I just did a couple slides here. This is actually all of the stops and the route that John Wilkes Booth took when he shot Lincoln and escaped. He was on the run for 8 days, and he first stopped here to get some supplies. Then he stopped at Dr. Samuel Mudd's house to get his broken leg fixed. And I literally followed the entire route that John Wilkes Booth followed when he escaped. As a matter of fact, you see right here where I drew this really, really terribly crooked red line in the woods. That actually looks like an old footpath because where I'm standing is where Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirator slept for 2 nights and heard federal Union troops marching through the woods looking for them. This is probably within 20 yards of where that actually was. So all of this was fascinating to me. I was just enthralled with this and I loved it. I had to go see where this man went. This is actually the house right behind here is the Potomac River. That's where he landed in Virginia. That's where he, finally hit the shores of Virginia. And you'll actually see here, Assassin's End. This is about 30 yards from where the barn was that Wilkes Booth was caught at. They burned the barn down to get him to come out, and then he was shot and killed when he came out of the barn. Those grounds are actually on U.S. Army property nowadays. So you can't get into there. There's only just a sign on the side of the roadway. And there's nothing that remains of the barn. The barn was burned down that day in 1865. So, but let me tell you, fascinating. And keep in mind, this is all places in Maryland and Virginia, very close to us. And you can literally, there's actually a tour you can take after COVID. They have a bus tour that take you to all these places. Very fascinating to see how this man shot and killed our president and was literally on the run for 8 days before he was actually found and caught. So I thought that was kind of a good full circle. I showed you all the history of some of these grave sites and these presidents, and then I brought you to the tragic end of 4 of our presidents where their assassins and their assassinations took place. So to kind of end this, of course, everybody asked me, well, what'd you take away from it all? What'd you learn? What's next? Any plans? And, the overwhelming thing that I took away from this was the contrast in memorials, that I touched on, how differing they were over the years. But really just the sad reality of how forgotten all these men are. And, not just some of our presidents that are actually forgotten, the Declaration signers and the vice presidents. Some of these vice presidents, I could tell there was one, Henry Wilson, who was actually Ulysses Grant's vice president. He's buried in a small cemetery up in Massachusetts. There was literally moss and like mold growing all over his headstone. It didn't look like it was maintained or anybody had seen it for 100 years. And it's just amazing to me that somebody that held the office of vice president is just so forgotten. And there's just so much, history when you go see these places and you realize who stood there at one point and who was here visiting and who was here during the day of the burial and what these men did, especially the Declaration signers. It's truly fascinating to see. And I got to go to some of the most unique, obscure places that I never thought I would ever go to. It took a global pandemic to allow me to do it, which is quite interesting to me. And just it was really cool. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about these men. I learned a lot about the history and even how divided our country has been at many times, not just at our current time, back during the Civil War and even back during when the country was being founded and created during the Declaration of Independence signing. A lot of division, a lot of differing views, but somehow we've come through it to be the greatest country on the face of the earth. So we have to keep reminding ourselves of that we are all Americans, and no matter of our differences, history is important. I understand why some history offends people because some of it is offensive. And I understand why some people want to maybe remove monuments and different things to people. And I understand that completely. But we also need to remember our history, no matter how dark or how wonderful it may be, because history, hopefully we don't repeat some of it. And then hopefully the good history, we will always remember the men and women, people like Susan B. Anthony, who I saw her gravesite, some people that really founded and created and molded our country. And I just hope that anybody that sees this little presentation takes away from it that go explore and see these places. Go to Independence Hall in Philadelphia. You will feel the history as soon as you walk in that building. It's truly incredible, and it's something that a textbook, and believe it or not, especially to you young adults, your Google and your social media can't teach you. Go experience these places. It's something that you need to experience. If you love history, go see it for yourself. What's next? Constitution signers. I actually only have 18 of those left. There's 39 people who signed the U.S. Constitution. I've seen 21 of them. I have 18 left. I'm actually probably second week of November going to be going all the way back down to Tennessee again, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina to see some Constitution signers. And I'm sure I'll stop and visit some of these vice presidents and stuff again, just because I'll be passing through. And that's really it. I mean, you guys are my very first presentation. I hope I wasn't too crazy or bad. And I've been asked by several schools, my son's school being one of them. They want me to talk to little kids about this. So I'm going to have to tweak my presentation a little bit to be like, this is Washington and this is Lincoln, because that's all they pretty much know. So, but it's been a lot of fun. This has been very humbling. It's been very fun and fascinating to me. And I hope it's been fascinating to all of you. Like I said, please get out there and see these things as much of it as you can, because it's truly an incredible, incredible thing to see this stuff when you're standing there for yourself. It's great. So now I will open it up to any questions.
Thank you so much. This was really great. It was really interesting and such a different take on looking at our history. And I thought it was really interesting how you're 100% right. How do we view the presidency at certain times? And we see that in how we honor people and their legacy after they leave. One of the things that I was curious about, because I only saw it maybe on two pictures, there's not like a standard, your standard presidential seal that somebody went back to and put on across the board.
No, there's not. As a matter of fact, you saw it on Coolidge's. It's ingrained. The presidential seal is engraved in his headstone. No, there's not. You saw, of course, at George H.W. Bush's. There's a big presidential seal logo in front on the ground. You would think that they would, but they don't. And the only thing that's really ever left on the presidential gravesites that I really found was you do get little American flags that are, plucked around. The presidential gravesites, one thing they do is they don't really let people leave stuff there. I think that the people that care for those gravesites, they're the most taken care of out of all the different categories I went through today. They don't let you really leave stuff except for maybe a little American flag. So I think if somebody even took it upon themselves to go try to put like a plaque of the presidential seal, it'd probably be taken away anyway. So, no, I mean, it kind of speaks to what I talked about Franklin Pierce. They didn't even recognize him in New Hampshire as president. Like there was nothing that said president on his grave for decades. Like if you would have walked up on it, you would have been like, oh, who's this dude? Who's Pierce? Right. There was nothing there. It's just amazing that some of them are very forgotten sites and very, very, very lost. That's for sure.
But I did notice, do you think more of the modern day presidents who have passed away, or from like going forward with modern day presidents, do you think we'll see more of that?
You will. You will. You'll probably see the presidential seal and that sort of thing. Again, the more recent presidents, Jimmy Carter, of course, is still alive. What's he, about 120 years old? He's like 96 years old. So God bless him. That's good for him. But when he eventually passes, yeah, you'll probably see like presidential seal somewhere around his grave or even on his gravestone. But they're very conservative now. I mean, you saw from Bush's, it's just a tiny little headstone. It's nothing. When you take a look at Warren Harding's and Lincoln's, it's these giant buildings, and it's just unbelievable. We've gone from conservative on your home property to these giant buildings, now back to like conservative. So I think you'll see it be more aesthetically pleasing moving forward. So, with presidential seals and that sort of thing. But I think you're going to see it be very conservative, except of course, if President Trump has his way, he'll probably have the biggest monument ever built to mankind when he eventually passes. So, but yeah, I mean, if they stay in the vein of what's been going on, it's very conservative now. It really is.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting though, like you said, it's good point you touched on, Erica. That it shows the view of how we view the office of presidency. It's become such. And it's not just for President Trump. That's such a misconception. When President Obama was in office, 50% of the country couldn't stand him either. I mean, but it's not even a matter of you differ on your political beliefs or your overall beliefs and the way of thinking. It's like this like disrespect for the office. It's just, there's no respect for it. And it's just amazing. I don't know where that happened in our history. It seems like it's happened in the social media era. where everybody has a voice and everybody has keyboard muscles, that they're going to say whatever they want. Um, it's just, if you talk badly about the president, years ago, that was taboo. You don't say that in public, especially in public. Now it's just like, everybody's on the street corner with signs that are saying terrible things about whoever the president is. It's sad.
Sure.
It really is sad. It made me disappointed a little bit. It really did. Because I want to see us, regardless of who you like or who you don't like, still respect the people that take office.
Sure, sure.
It's important.
Yeah, probably this trip probably just, highlighted that for you. What I thought was interesting was actually all my kids are named after presidents. We went with presidential names,
Very
right? So
cool.
we have Andrew, we have Jackson, we fought over Calvin. And so Calvin, we don't have a Calvin, we have
Okay.
James, but Calvin Coolidge was one of my husband's presidents that he liked. But I thought it was interesting. You could kind of understand with some of the earlier presidents how you showed, okay, so they had these big plantations and these big estates, and those meant something to them, and they wanted to be buried with their family on these estates. That that makes sense. But then you showed a picture of Calvin Coolidge, like literally on the side of a road, and you go, really? Right. So that's interesting.
But it speaks to who he was. It really does. If you read about Calvin Coolidge, he was a very simplistic man. And I think that speaks volumes to where you look at his gravesite. You look at people like, Washington was a little different. Washington was an extremely humble man who never even wanted to be president to begin with. He didn't believe in that sort of thing. He definitely didn't believe in political parties, which he was light years ahead of his time regarding that. So he wouldn't want that pomp and circumstance, that glitz and glamour. He wouldn't have wanted that. But then you have somebody like Andrew Jackson, who was a little bit more egotistical, or you have somebody like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, who, had kind of a Napoleon complex, short guy. He wanted, put me in a big, nice tomb. Like, it just reflects their personalities, I think, a little bit. But it also, there was a trend of just kind of simplistic, and then it got to these big things, and then simplistic again. And it's just very interesting to see. I have to ask, Erica, has your husband ever gone and seen Coolidge's gravesite?
No, we have not.
Do it. I promise you, do it. It's quite incredible.
He's one of the presidents that he did like, though. He likes the
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I mean, just to see where everything took place with him, his birth, it's very interesting. And believe it or not, though, little side note, he's not buried the closest to his birth house in his childhood home. That's actually Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's actually buried in the backyard of his boyhood home in Yorba Linda, California. So he actually is the closest in proximity to where he was born to where he's buried. Even though Coolidge is only within like a half mile, he's not the closest. But this was awesome. I'm telling you, just to see the contrast of all these different things was just so mind-blowingly incredible. And then I drive through a cornfield in Virginia, and it's like, oh, there's a Declaration sign in the middle of this cornfield. And it was so interesting to me to see all these different contrasts. And it's like, wow. And it would also open my eyes, because apparently I was very out of touch, because my best friend who I originally talked to about this idea, he said to me, no one even knows who signed the Declaration of Independence. We were sitting outside his house one day having this conversation. This was only like 2 months ago. And this couple was walking down the sidewalk, and they were probably in their late 20s, maybe early 30s. He said, Dad, I said, I bet you if I ask them who the most famous signature on the Declaration of Independence are, they'll tell me John Hancock. The biggest, it's probably the most famous, signature. Neither one of them could tell me. In fact, neither one of them barely even knew who John Hancock was. So it made me also realize how out of touch with reality I was, that no one even knows I don't expect people to know who all the vice presidents are. Who the hell knows that? I'd probably, even though I saw all of them, I'd struggle with that kind of question. But to not know who John Hancock is, or to not know that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams signed the Declaration, I feel like this is stuff that we all learned when we were 10 or 11 years old in school. But even if we did learn it, it went in this ear and out the other. It's just something that doesn't resonate with people. And to me, the reason that we have a country like we do is because of these people who I visited. And it's important not to forget that. Regardless of what your opinions or views are, it's important not to forget that. It's very forgotten.
TJ, just real quick, something that kind of like really jumped out to me a lot is that, like you were kind of saying as you went through your presentation, how there's a lot of them that just have something that's very simple or almost non-existent. And it's kind of shocking in that regard that people who had such a huge impact on American history. I mean, you look at John Wilkes Booth's monument, and that one's grander than some of the presidents of the United States. That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not really a question. It's just more of that really leapt out at me when you were explaining this stuff.
Absolutely. No, it's a great observation. Wilkes Booth, that big obelisk you see, he's actually buried on a family plot. All his family's right there. His family, he actually came from money. Of course, his father was an actor. Wilkes Booth was an actor. But yeah, I mean, just to go see it visually, you're like, wow, it's a pretty big thing. It says Booth on it. And then, yeah, you go to like Calvin Coolidge's and it's like, what? It's like Martin Van Buren's. He's in Kinderhook, New York, this little tiny town in upstate New York. And yeah, his obelisk is probably 10 to 15 foot high, but it's literally like think about you're driving through like the back country roads of New Jersey and you'll come across like a little roadside cemetery. That's what it's like. It's literally there's the 8th president of the United States. But then you get to Kennedy's and it's like, you get out of line and the guards, guarding the tombs are ready to shoot you. Like you got to be. They're so securely protected. It's just so interesting, the different contrasts. Of course, Arlington is a little bit of an exception because it's the most heavily secured and guarded cemetery in our country, without even a question. But yeah, it's interesting. Really, some of these, there was actually little headstones of some of the vice presidents that I literally had to take my hands and physically tear apart grass to read their headstone because it was so overgrown and not taken care of or maintained. And these are men that, with the grace of God, could have became president, all would have taken someone to die in office or something. They would have been president of the United States. And here it is, just forgotten. So I hope this was a little bit, insightful for you guys and entertaining. I wanted it to be not only something that you maybe learned a thing or two, but it also was a little bit entertaining. I have thousands and thousands of pictures of every single one of these grave sites I was at. So if anybody, Erica, feel free to share my email address with anybody who wants to contact me. I'd be more than happy to send you some stuff. I have Dropbox folders with all of the pictures in it. If anybody just wanted to take a look and browse, I'd be more than happy to add you to have permission to do that. It's been really fun. I've seen everything. In my travels, I stopped and saw the corner where George Floyd was murdered by the police officer in Minnesota. Of course, I was at Martin Luther King's, where he was assassinated in Memphis, and his gravesite in Atlanta, which is one of the most spectacular gravesites you'll ever see. His tomb sits in literally in the middle of this pond, like lake. It's spectacularly beautiful. And then, the most people ask me, was there any moments of emotion? I actually did get very emotional when I stood in the driveway of Medgar Evers, where Medgar Evers was assassinated and killed, the civil rights leader, because that house in Jackson, Mississippi has not changed. Myrtle Evers, his widow, donated that to the town. And the town now, I believe it's the University of Mississippi, actually owns that property. And they literally have not changed it, to the point of literally where the bullet went in the side window is still the original piece of cardboard that they put up. They never even repaired the window. And then, of course, I saw Medgar Evers' grave. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Just overwhelmed with emotion standing there to know that this man who just wanted better things for everybody and equal rights for everybody was brutally murdered in front of his little kids in his driveway. It just shows you history, and to be there, like I said, to all, there's kids that are watching this, younger adults, you can't learn it on your phones. You can't learn it in a textbook. Go see it and feel it and be there. and you'll really understand the history more. You really will. Any other
I
questions?
saw that. Yeah, I saw you unmuted, Ken. Did you have a question?
Just a comment. I think that I think the pandemic itself was a blessing in disguise because we were able to visit all these places. And when I visited, say, Arlington, I've been to Independence, Missouri. There were people there and crowds. And if you snap a picture, there's always somebody in the background. And so you did pick the right time. Unfortunately, it was a pandemic to visit these places.
Yes. Yeah. No. It's a great point, Ken. Because you yourself who have visited these places, you know firsthand. Like, I wasn't exaggerating when I say, please don't let my photos give you this false sense of hope that you're going to go there and I'm going to have John Kennedy's grave all to myself. It's never going to happen. It literally took a pandemic and for me to do this during this time to truly, and it's things that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. Special moments of standing at these men's graves with nobody around, like just hearing the birds chirp or the wind blow. You don't get that. You just don't get that, especially at these presidential grave sites. That's why Lincoln will forever remain my #1 most favorite president site I saw, because I walked down this hall by myself and there it was. It was just like, whoa. It was just something overwhelming about it. So it was wonderful. It really, truly was. It was incredible.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for giving us your time and for taking the time to put such a good presentation together for us.